Welcome to this tutorial on applications for clinical investigations of medical devices under the Medical Device Regulation. Here, you'll learn how to identify the right regulatory pathway for your study and how to prepare a strong submission package for approval by competent authorities and ethics committees. In this tutorial, we'll walk through how to apply for approval of a clinical investigation and how to prepare your submission package. We'll also look at which documents are required and how the overall approval process works. This tutorial is for anyone working with clinical research on medical devices and planning a clinical investigation. You'll get practical tips and insights based on real experience from our clinical development team at GBA Key to Compliance. Here, we'll walk you through applications under the Medical Device Regulation, or MDR. The MDR sets the common framework across the EU, while applications for clinical investigations are handled at national level. To make this easier to follow, we'll use examples from Sweden to show how an MDR-based application can look in practice. Before submitting your own application, we therefore recommend checking the national guidance that applies in the country where your study will be conducted. Let's start with the basics. There are 5 key things to think about. First, is your study actually a clinical investigation under the Medical Device Regulation? Second, what's the risk class of your device? Third, what's your role in the study? And what type of investigation are you planning? Finally, how will you prepare and submit the required documents? Let's start with the first question. Is your planned study a clinical investigation under the MDR? To fall under the MDR, 2 conditions must be met. First, the product must meet the definition of a medical device described in Article 1 of the MDR. Second, the study must be a systematic investigation involving human subjects designed to assess safety or performance as defined in Article 2. If these criteria aren't met, you might still need some form of approval. So always check with your national competent authority or contact us for guidance. If your study is a clinical investigation under the MDR, the next step is to identify the correct regulatory pathway. Before you can start a clinical investigation, you need approval from the Ethics Committee and, in most cases, also the competent authority. To understand which regulatory pathway applies, you first need to know a few things about your device. What is its risk class and does it already have a CE mark? And what type of investigation are you planning? Is it a pre-market, post-market, or perhaps a study to extend the intended purpose, such as a new indication or any other type? For low-risk devices, meaning Class 1 and non-invasive Class 2A and 2B devices, the process follows national rules, as described in Article 70.7a of the MDR. In Sweden, for example, this means that you submit a notification to the Swedish competent authority. They validate the application and forward it to the Swedish Ethical Review Authority, who then reviews the application and provides a decision within 40 days. For higher-risk devices, such as Class 3, invasive Class 2A and 2B, and custom-made or in-house devices, the process instead follows Article 70.7b of the MDR. In these cases, you need approval from both the competent authority and the Ethics Committee. The exact process depends on the type of investigation, which we will dive into next. This image gives an overview of the regulatory pathways for high-risk devices. When planning your clinical investigation, start by asking yourself 3 key questions. First, is the device already CE marked? Second, is it planned to be CE marked? And third, is it not intended to be CE marked, for example, if it's a custom-made or in-house device? Based on your answers, there are 3 main regulatory pathways. Article 62 applies to pre-market studies such as first-in-human or pivotal studies, and also when testing a CE mark device outside its intended purpose, for example, to extend the CE mark. Article 74.1 applies to post-market clinical follow-up studies, or PMCF, when the device is used within its intended purpose but involves additional invasive or burdensome procedures for the participants. Article 82 applies to PMCF studies without any additional invasive procedures or to other investigations not done for conformity assessment. Now, let's for instance look at how this works in Sweden. For Article 62, shown in red boxes, approval is required from both the competent authority and the Swedish Ethical Review Authority. You submit the application to the competent authority who validates it and forwards it to the Swedish Ethical Review Authority, who perform a joint review within 45 days, which can be extended by 20 days. If questions arise, the timeline is paused. For Article 74.1, shown in green, a notification must be sent to competent authority at least 30 days before the intended study starts. The Swedish Ethical Review Authority must also approve the study. You submit the application via the competent authority, who forwards it to Swedish Ethical Review Authority for review within 30 days. For Article 82, shown in yellow, the same procedure applies as for Article 74.1. Studies that fall outside the MDR must still be assessed by Ethics Committee. These are, however, submitted directly to the Ethics Committee. There are two main roles in a clinical investigation: the sponsor and the investigator. The sponsor is the company, institution, or organization responsible for initiating, managing, and financing the study. They may also be the manufacturer of the device under investigation. In some cases, the sponsor and the investigator are the same person. These are referred to as investigator-initiated studies. According to the MDR, the sponsor is responsible for submitting applications for clinical investigations to both the competent authority and the Ethics Committee. However, procedures differ between countries. In some countries, separate submissions are required, and either the sponsor or the investigator may handle the Ethics Committee submission. In Sweden, for example, it is the sponsor who is responsible for applications for MDR studies with joint review by the competent authority and the Ethics Committee. For studies outside the scope of the MDR, ethics review procedures are governed by national legislation. In Sweden, these applications are typically submitted by the investigator. A third party, such as a clinical research organization or CRO, can also be authorized to submit on behalf of the sponsor. The responsibility, however, will still remain with the sponsor. It's important to remember that the device used in a clinical investigation, called the investigational device, must meet the general safety and performance requirements of the MDR, except for the parts that are being studied. The manufacturer is always responsible for having documentation that demonstrates the device's safety and performance, even if the sponsor is a different party. If the manufacturer makes any changes to the device, for example by relabeling it, they must make sure it still meets the requirements. Both the manufacturers and the sponsors should also have written agreements with any subcontractors involved in handling the investigational device to ensure that quality requirements are followed. The first step in preparing your submission is to get the CIV ID, also called the EUDAMED number. This is a unique ID assigned to each clinical investigation and retrieved from the EUDAMED database by the competent authority. The CIV ID is required before or at the time of submission. For multinational studies, the CIV ID is issued by the authority in the country where the first submission is made. Keep in mind that procedures for obtaining the CIV ID differ between countries. It's a good idea to request the CIV ID well in advance, since it must be included in all study documentation. Once the CIV ID is in place, the next step is to prepare the submission documentation. The MDR sets out which documents are required for a clinical investigation. This information is described in dedicated annexes of the MDR. In addition, the Medical Device Coordination Group guidance documents provide practical recommendations on application and notification documentation, including examples of essential documents typically expected as part of a submission. Finally, remember that additional national requirements may also apply. Always consult the relevant competent authority's website to confirm local expectations before submitting your application. Let's take a closer look at the essential documents typically included in a clinical investigation submission in Sweden. First, a cover letter is included to introduce the application and provide an overview of the submission. Next is the application form, often referred to as the EUDAMED form for clinical investigations under the MDR. This form can be downloaded from the Swedish Competent Authority's website. It allows space for one investigational device, one comparator, and a limited number of study sites. If needed, additional information can be provided in separate attachments. The submission also includes the investigator's brochure, or IB, together with any relevant attachments. The IB is expected to follow MDR and ISO 14155 principles. If the investigational device is used within its intended purpose, the instructions for use, or IFU, may be sufficient instead. A checklist covering the general safety and performance requirements, together with a list of applied standards, is also included. Practical templates for this are available in MDCG guidance documents. In addition, a clinical evaluation plan, or CEP, is part of the submission package. The Clinical Investigation Plan, or CIP, describes how the study will be conducted and should align with MDR and ISO 14155 expectations. Finally, in Sweden, a short CIP synopsis in Swedish is required. A template for this is available on the Swedish Competent Authorities website. In addition to the core submission documents, a number of supporting documents are typically required as part of a clinical investigation application. One of these is the Declaration of Conformity for the investigational device. This document should be prepared in line with MDR requirements and signed by the legal or natural person responsible for manufacturing the device. An ethics application form is also included. National ethics committees usually provide templates and specify the language to be used. In Sweden, the form is completed in Swedish and downloaded from the Ethics Committee's website. Documentation for the investigational sites is required to demonstrate that each site is suitably qualified and resourced. This typically includes CVs and GCP certificates for the principal investigator, as well as site-specific documentation signed by the site manager. Insurance documentation is submitted to show what patient injury insurance applies to participating healthcare providers and whether the sponsor has specific insurance coverage for the clinical investigation. Finally, patient-facing documents, such as the patient information sheet and informed consent form, are included. These should align with MDR principles and applicable ethical and clinical standards, and national templates may be available. Beyond the main submission documents, there are a few additional elements to be aware of during the application process. This includes any materials intended for use with study participants, such as questionnaires, diaries, or advertisement materials. Information on data protection and confidentiality is also provided, describing how personal data will be handled in line with applicable data protection requirements. This information can be included as a separate document or as part of the clinical investigation plan. Administrative details such as invoicing information may also be requested, and national competent authorities typically provide guidance on what is expected. During the review process, ethics committees or competent authorities may request additional documentation. This often relates to information already described elsewhere in the submission, for example in the investigator's brochure, such as risk management or biocompatibility documentation where relevant. Finally, if a third party, such as an experienced clinical research organisation, is involved in preparing or submitting the application on behalf of the sponsor, appropriate authorization documentation should be included. If your study involves collecting human biological samples such as blood or tissue, you need to check whether a separate biobank submission is required. In Sweden, this depends on whether the Swedish Biobanks Act applies to your study. That's determined by how the samples will be stored and analysed. If a biobank application is needed, it must be submitted in parallel with the submission to the competent authority and the ethics committee. The Swedish competent authority will forward the relevant documents to the regional biobank centres, but it's the sponsor's responsibility to submit the biobank application. You can find detailed guidance and instructions on the Biobank Sweden website. It's our recommendation to start this process early, since the biobank number and agreement must be in place before the study begins. And remember that procedures differ between countries, so always check the local requirements. For clinical investigations under the MDR, the application is submitted through the competent authority's website. For investigations outside the MDR, the application is submitted through the Ethics Committee's web system called Ethics. This must be done by the investigator using a Swedish e-identity. Let's have a look at the review and approval timelines. Once the submission is sent, the competent authority will first validate the application. They check whether the investigation is covered by the MDR and whether all required documents are included. If something is missing, or if the study doesn't fall under the MDR, they will contact the sponsor. The sponsor then has 10 calendar days to respond. If the application is complete, they will notify the sponsor and move forward with the review. If not, the application will be refused. For low-risk device investigations, the competent authority forwards the application to the Ethics Committee, who reviews it and provides a decision to the sponsor within 40 days. For high-risk devices under Article 74.1 or 82, the competent authority also forwards the application to the Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee then assesses the application and gives a decision within 30 days. For Article 62 investigations, the competent authority and the Ethics Committee review the application jointly. The timeline is 45 days, but it may be extended by 20 days depending on the complexity of the study. If the competent authority or the Ethics Committee send questions to the sponsor, the clock stops until a response is received. When your investigation is approved, make sure you follow any conditions or requirements set by the competent authority or the Ethics Committee. This concludes our tutorial on what to consider when preparing and submitting a clinical investigation application to a competent authority and an ethics committee. If you would like additional guidance or practical support, feel free to contact us. We can support you throughout the full submission process, from preparation and review to submission, across different EU countries in line with national requirements. Thank you for joining this session. We look forward to supporting you on your clinical investigation journey. If you'd like more guidance or practical support, feel free to contact us. We can handle the full submission process for you or review your draft and provide expert feedback. Thank you for joining this session. We look forward to supporting you on your clinical investigation journey.